Picture this. You are a Roman senator, wealthy, noble, powerful. Your family name stretches back centuries. You wear the purple-trimmed toga symbol of your elite status. And tonight, you've received the greatest honor a Roman citizen could hope for, a personal invitation to dine with the emperor. You should be proud. You should be ecstatic. But as you ascend the polished marble steps of the Palatine Hill, your stomach knots with something else, fear. The kind that sits deep in the gut and doesn't let go. The palace guards won't meet your eyes. The air smells of perfume and incense, but it can't cover the stench of something darker. Power here doesn't whisper, it devours. And behind those golden doors lies a man worshipped as a god, feared like a demon. Then it begins. The sound of footsteps, laughter sharp, high, unhinged. Emperor Caligula has arrived, and with him comes the collapse of everything Rome once believed sacred. What unfolds tonight is not a feast. It is a test, a ritual, a performance. And you are not a guest, you are prey. This is not just the story of a mad emperor. It is a warning. Because when one man is allowed to own the bodies, minds, and souls of others, what dies first is not law, but human dignity. And what follows is a descent into something no civilization, no matter how grand, is ever truly prepared to face. The invitation arrives on gilded parchment sealed with the imperial crest, an emblem of power so absolute few dare to question it. You hold it in trembling hands, your name etched beside a summons to dine with Emperor Caligula himself. It should be a triumph, the pinnacle of a senator's career. But instead, it feels like a sentence. As twilight falls over Rome, you make your way toward the Palatine Hill, the sky burning red behind the silhouette of the imperial palace. Every step echoes louder than the last. The guards posted at the entrance say nothing, their faces carved in stone. Inside, the great hall is bathed in candlelight filled with Rome's most powerful figures, senators, generals, merchants, their wives and daughters, standing in unnatural silence as if waiting for something they all fear but cannot name. Then you hear it. Footsteps, soft at first. Then laughter, unsettling, maniacal. Caligula enters robed in silk that glistens like blood under the torchlight. His eyes sweep the room not with welcome, but with hunger. And then he speaks, his voice bright with cruelty. Tonight we will see who truly loves their emperor. To understand the monster Rome feared, you must first understand the child it betrayed. Caligula was born Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus in 12 CE, son of the beloved general Germanicus and Agrippina the Elder, a woman of fierce ambition and noble blood. As a toddler, he marched alongside legions in miniature armor, earning the nickname Caligula Little Boots. But behind the charming image was a childhood soaked in paranoia and grief. By age 7, Caligula had seen his father die under mysterious circumstances, suspected poisoning, ordered by Emperor Tiberius. He watched powerless as his mother and brothers were arrested, exiled, and slowly erased one by one. He learned that in the empire, family loyalty meant nothing, and weakness invited death. So he adapted. He smiled when it was safest. He said little. He survived by becoming invisible. Under Tiberius's watchful eye, he lived not as a child, but as a shadow, a creature who knew that to trust was to die. These early wounds did not heal. They metastasized into something Rome would one day regret, unleashing a man who mistook survival for domination and fear for loyalty. When Tiberius finally died in 37 CE, Rome rejoiced. The people hailed Caligula not as a ruler, but as a savior, the bright young son of Germanicus, a living symbol of Rome's lost glory. For 7 months he played the part well. He recalled political exiles, distributed generous bonuses to soldiers, and hosted games that dazzled the public. Statues were raised, prayers were answered. But then, everything changed. Late that year, Caligula fell gravely ill with what ancient sources described as a brain fever. For days he hovered between life and death, and all of Rome held its breath. When he awoke, it was not to celebration. It was to silence confusion, dread. Something in him had broken, or perhaps something had been set free. Gone was the controlled, gracious young emperor. In his place stood a man untethered from empathy or restraint, drunk on the knowledge that no law, no God, no man could stop him. His illness had not only altered his body, it had shattered the last barriers between impulse and action. And with that, the palace stopped being a court. It became a stage for one man's unraveling and everyone else's nightmare. The transformation began quietly behind closed doors and whispers. In gasps, no one dared report. Palace staff were the first to feel the shift. Servants who had faithfully served the imperial household for years were suddenly at the mercy of the emperor's twisted whims. Young male slaves were summoned to his chambers and subjected to unspeakable acts, stripped not only of clothing but of dignity, humanity, and the right to refuse. Yet it was the women who suffered most. Caligula would stalk the palace corridors at night like a predator, selecting female attendants at random. These encounters were not romantic nor even impulsive. They were calculated demonstrations of absolute control acts designed to humiliate, degrade, and remind everyone that no one, not even within sacred palace walls, was beyond his reach. Consent was irrelevant. Resistance was dangerous. These weren't hidden crimes, they were rituals of fear committed in the open and cloaked in silence. For Caligula, domination became the true currency of power. And in the quiet corners of the imperial palace, the echoes of his cruelty began to drown out the last remnants of Rome's civility. But Caligula's appetite for control did not stop with slaves. Soon his gaze turned toward the very pillars of Roman society, the wives of senators, diplomats, and generals. Women born into privilege, raised under strict codes of honor, suddenly found themselves summoned for private audiences with the emperor. The pretense was diplomatic, discussing their husbands' careers, family affairs, but the truth was far more sinister. These women were trapped, offered up like tributes in a silent war for survival. Refusal wasn't an option. Denying the emperor meant risking exile, disgrace, or even death for themselves and their entire families. Caligula would force them to strip to perform for him like actors in a grotesque drama, often with multiple women at once. And he watched, not with desire, but with detachment. It was never about pleasure. It was about breaking them. Reducing Rome's most respected women into objects of public humiliation sent a chilling message. Virtue was meaningless. Honor was fragile, and no bloodline, no matter how noble, could protect against the emperor's will. In Caligula's Rome, power wasn't inherited. It was taken, desecrated, and paraded for all to see. What began in private soon spilled into public spectacle. Caligula transformed formal dinners into twisted performances, grand feasts that devolved into arenas of psychological warfare. Senators and their families were invited to what appeared to be lavish gatherings, fine wine, music, laughter echoing through marble halls. But beneath the surface, dread pulsed like a second heartbeat. As the night progressed, the emperor's requests grew bolder, more grotesque. He would gesture casually across the table, smiling as he addressed a senator. "Your wife has such beautiful eyes. I wonder what they'd look like." On her knees. The room would fall silent. Everyone knew the rules. Protest meant death, not just for the man, but for his children, his lineage, his legacy. And so the women complied, in front of their husbands, in front of their sons. The humiliation wasn't incidental, it was the purpose. Caligula savored their silence, their shame, their internal collapse. Marriages unraveled, families fractured. Trust was shattered in a single evening. And the most terrifying part, no one ever knew when it would be their turn, or if they'd survive the next invitation. To accommodate his growing depravity, Caligula didn't just alter behavior, he altered architecture. The imperial palace on Palatine Hill was no longer a center of governance, but a carefully engineered theater of submission. He ordered the construction of special chambers designed explicitly for group sexual acts, fitted with circular couches for maximum visibility. These weren't hidden alcoves. They were stages. One room described by ancient sources resembled a private amphitheater, raised seating surrounding a central platform where bodies were displayed like entertainment. The message was clear. This wasn't just indulgence. It was domination broadcast to Rome's elite, like a lesson carved in stone. The emperor's personal bedroom was designed not for rest, but for exposure. Multiple entryways allowed for a rotating audience. Caligula enjoyed being watched as much as he enjoyed watching. He turned intimacy into performance, and every performance into a demonstration of imperial power. Those brought into these rooms weren't partners, they were props, and the walls, gilded and silent, bore witness to acts that shattered lives in the name of spectacle. The palace wasn't merely corrupted, it was re-engineered to humiliate on command. But Caligula's cruelty didn't stop at design, it evolved into institutionalized degradation. Within the palace walls, he established what can only be described as a brothel staffed not by common prostitutes, but by the wives and daughters of senators who had fallen out of favor. These women, once the pride of Rome's nobility, were forced to service not only the emperor, but also his guests, foreign dignitaries, soldiers, even palace staff. It was humiliation by design, orchestrated by the emperor himself, who often observed the acts, offering commentary, as if directing a theatrical production. He turned noble bloodlines into commodities, their bodies currency, in a court ruled by terror. And those who watched husbands, fathers, sons were not mere bystanders. They were participants in a spectacle that blurred every line between family and power, virtue and violence. To refuse was to risk annihilation. To comply was to surrender the last fragments of identity and honor. In Caligula's Rome, sex was no longer private. It was policy, and this brothel at the heart of the empire wasn't just a perversion of morality, it was a blueprint for domination masked as entertainment. Caligula understood something chilling: if you could violate the sacred, you could own the soul of an entire civilization. So he went further, weaponizing sex not just against individuals, but against the very foundations of Roman identity. He transformed political meetings into rituals of humiliation. During formal Senate sessions, he would summon senators' wives mid-debate, demanding they perform sexual acts in full view of their husbands and peers. The chamber meant for lawmaking became a stage of silent obedience where political decisions unfolded beside acts of forced degradation. Religious ceremonies, too, were defiled. Caligula claimed divine status and rewrote the rules of worship. Temple rituals, once solemn symbolic acts, were twisted into orgiastic performances done in his honor. Priestesses sworn to chastity were forced into public intercourse as offerings to their living god. Festivals became spectacles, their original meaning drowned beneath waves of coerced ecstasy and spectacle. Even weddings, Rome's most sacred family ritual, were perverted. Caligula would sometimes consummate marriages publicly, in front of the bride's father and guests, using the act not as union but as conquest. In his empire, nothing was too sacred to corrupt. Everything was his to desecrate. Caligula's madness didn't just exploit sex, it monetized it. He introduced a grotesque form of economic extortion, turning the bodies of Rome's noblewomen into bargaining chips. Wealthy families were informed, sometimes politely, often not, that their daughters or wives were expected to attend the emperor. In return, they would receive political protection, tax relief, or simply be spared from ruin. The unspoken rule was clear: deny him and your family's fortune status, and possibly lives would vanish overnight. Some families tried to negotiate, others hoped to delay, but all knew resistance was futile. Over time, this coercion evolved into a formal system. Families were required to send women for scheduled service at the palace, with frequency and duration scaled according to their wealth. It wasn't prostitution, it was sexual taxation. Women became installments in a perverse economy of survival, and for those who refused, the consequences were devastating. Public punishment, confiscated estates, generational disgrace. In Caligula's Rome, virtue wasn't just worthless, it was dangerous. And wealth didn't buy immunity. It bought more exposure. The higher your status, the more your family owed in flesh, not coin. For the women trapped in Caligula's empire, the torment went far beyond the physical. These were daughters of Rome's proudest houses, raised to believe that chastity was honor, that virtue was power, that their bodies were sacred extensions of family and faith. Now those same bodies were bartered, exposed, and violated under the emperor's gaze. The psychological toll was devastating. Forced to perform acts that shattered their personal boundaries and spiritual beliefs, many women experienced what we would now recognize as complete psychological collapse. Some tried to resist. A few chose suicide, believing death was the only escape from a life of ritualized degradation. But even that decision came with unbearable cost. Caligula often punished entire families when a woman took her own life, executing siblings, bankrupting estates, or forcing surviving daughters to take her place. There was no true escape, only the illusion of choice. What Caligula perfected was not merely physical domination, but total psychological erosion. He didn't just break bodies, he broke identities. He turned faith into fear and womanhood into a sentence. In doing so, he rewrote the meaning of nobility in Rome, not as a mark of honor, but as a target. But perhaps the most insidious cruelty was what Caligula demanded of the men. Fathers, husbands, brothers. These weren't just silent witnesses to the abuse of their wives and daughters, they were forced into complicity. The emperor commanded that fathers personally deliver their daughters to the palace, that husbands prepare their wives for the knight's demands, that brothers restrain sisters during public sexual acts. It wasn't enough for these men to lose control. They had to become participants in their own family's destruction. And Caligula knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't just asserting dominance, he was annihilating the very foundation of Roman masculinity, the illusion of control, honor, and legacy. A senator who once commanded armies now tied his wife down for the emperor's pleasure. A father, once the guardian of his lineage, became the usher of his daughter's violation. And afterward, these men returned to the Senate, expected to debate laws and lead provinces as if nothing had changed. But everything had. Their authority was a corpse dressed in ceremony. Caligula had infected their souls with shame, ensuring they'd never again rise without first remembering how deeply they had bowed. Among the most tragic victims of Caligula's empire were the children, those too young to understand the horror around them, yet old enough to carry its weight for the rest of their lives. Children of Rome's elite, once destined for greatness, were brought to palace gatherings where innocence met brutality in the cruelest of ways. Ancient sources speak in cautious language, their silence more haunting than words. But what they make clear is this: children were not shielded. They witnessed acts no child should ever see, acts that shattered their understanding of trust, safety, and human connection. Some were used to amplify the fear, forced to stand by as their mothers were humiliated. Others were enlisted in ceremonies that blurred every moral line. The trauma carved into these young minds ran deep. Many grew up unable to form healthy relationships, repeating cycles of abuse or retreating entirely from intimacy. Caligula didn't just corrupt a generation, he seeded dysfunction into Rome's future. In poisoning childhood itself, he ensured that the damage of his reign would echo long after his death, not just in politics or history books, but in the broken psyches of those who never got to be children at all. As Caligula's obsession with control deepened, he took his reign of terror one step further. He declared himself a living god. But this wasn't just blasphemy, it was strategy. By wrapping his abuses in the language of divinity, he turned degradation into worship and obedience into sacred duty. He constructed temples within the palace, not for prayer, but for performance. In these spaces, sexual acts were no longer personal violations, they were rebranded as religious offerings. To refuse was not just disloyalty, it was heresy. Worshippers, including Rome's elite, were required to participate in ritualized displays of submission, often orchestrated with formal ceremony. The emperor stood at the center like a divine conductor, directing bodies as if they were instruments of his sacred will. Priestesses who had once taken vows of purity were compelled to participate, their sanctity stripped under the weight of divine initiation. Even children were told they were part of sacred rites, their confusion manipulated into compliance. Caligula didn't just erase boundaries between faith and power, he weaponized them. In his Rome, belief itself became a leash, and the gods were merely masks for absolute human control. Caligula's corruption didn't stay confined within the palace walls, it spread like a plague across the empire. Through governors, generals, and imperial officials, he exported his blueprint of domination to every corner of Roman territory. These men, eager to please the emperor and avoid suspicion, established their own miniature courts, modeled after Caligula's twisted rituals. Local elites were pressured to offer their wives and daughters to visiting dignitaries. Religious festivals in the provinces were redesigned to include ceremonial acts of submission. The empire became a patchwork of fear, where no family, no matter how distant from Rome, felt entirely safe. Reports of these practices were quietly sent back to the capital, often exaggerated in their cruelty to win Caligula's favor. A grotesque competition emerged: who could show the emperor the most extravagant proof of loyalty, and always women paid the price. Even in the outermost provinces, a noblewoman's body could be claimed in the name of imperial unity. What had started as one man's madness was now a system. Sexual subjugation had become policy, and millions lived under the shadow of a government that no longer ruled by law but by intimate fear. By 40 CE, Caligula's reign had descended into something almost mythic in its depravity. The palace became a stage for grotesque spectacles, orgies that lasted for days, involving senators, their families, entertainers, slaves, and even animals. These were not hidden indulgences. They were public declarations that no boundary, moral, social, or human, could withstand the emperor's will. Caligula no longer sought pleasure, he sought symbolism. Every act, no matter how extreme, was meant to send a message: I am beyond shame and you are beneath dignity. He arranged elaborate performances in which entire families were forced to participate or watch, unable to intervene. Guests were summoned not for politics or counsel, but for their bodies and silence. The emperor reveled in orchestrating the collapse of Rome's most sacred ideals: marriage, honor, fatherhood, all reduced to props in his theater of cruelty. These final months weren't just excess, they were philosophical. Caligula was making a point that in a world where one man holds unchecked power, civilization is nothing more than costume. And behind the marble columns and golden robes, there was only performance, submission, and ruin. The end came underground, literally. On January 24, 41 CE, members of the Praetorian Guard cornered Caligula in a palace corridor and assassinated him, ending 4 years of terror with a flurry of blades. But even in death, his shadow lingered. Many of his killers had personal reasons: wives humiliated, daughters destroyed, honor shattered. The new emperor Claudius inherited more than a throne. He inherited a crime scene. The palace was littered with evidence chambers designed for voyeurism, detailed records of coerced encounters, even artwork depicting real victims in acts of degradation. But instead of confronting the truth, Claudius ordered a quiet cover-up. Rooms were sealed or redesigned, documents were burned. The goal wasn't to protect Caligula's name, it was to shield the reputations of Rome's elite and spare surviving victims further shame. Ancient historians recorded what they could, often in veiled language. But the silence was intentional. In a society built on honor, speaking of such violations was unthinkable. And so the empire moved on, not cleansed but repressed. Caligula was dead, but the damage was buried, not healed. And beneath the polished marble floors, the echoes of what had happened refused to fade. The wounds Caligula left behind didn't vanish with his death, they metastasized. Rome's elite, those once seen as pillars of virtue and leadership, were now fractured from within. Marriages destroyed by forced submission never recovered. Fathers who had been made complicit in their daughters' suffering could no longer look them in the eye. Sons who had watched their mothers humiliated carried guilt they couldn't name. And the children, the ones who had grown up inside the walls of terror, entered adulthood warped by trauma they were never allowed to speak of. Some became abusers themselves, perpetuating the cycles they had learned. Others withdrew from intimacy altogether, haunted by associations they could never shake. What Caligula had done was more than scandal. It was social destabilization on a generational scale. The trauma passed quietly from parent to child, reshaping the emotional landscape of Rome's upper class. Publicly, these families maintained appearances, but privately they were changed forever. In turning the empire's nobility into victims, collaborators, and silence bearers, Caligula didn't just corrupt power, he rewrote Rome's moral DNA. And the empire would carry that infection for decades, long after his name was officially erased. Caligula's legacy was not etched in marble, but in shame, and yet it endured. Later emperors may have condemned his name, but they understood his methods. Sexual exploitation, once taboo, had proven to be a potent weapon of control. Some future rulers didn't replicate his extremes, but they quietly adopted his philosophy that violating the private lives of citizens was the ultimate form of submission. And the people, they learned to adapt, to look away, to protect themselves through silence. Tourists now stroll through the ruins of the Palatine Hill, marveling at faded mosaics and grand columns, unaware that beneath their feet once stood rooms designed for humiliation, for forced compliance, for ritualized fear. Drainage systems carried away more than water. They erased evidence tears' blood humanity. The ghosts remain invisible but heavy. The senator's wife who ended her life, the little boy who never spoke again, the noble matron turned into a public spectacle. Their stories were not carved into stone, they were scrubbed from it. But if you listen closely, if you look past the grandeur, you might still hear the echoes. Caligula built more than a palace. He built a blueprint for tyranny, cloaked in silence. Caligula's reign lasted less than 4 years, but its impact outlived generations. What he unleashed wasn't just horror, it was a revelation. That civilization, for all its laws, temples, and traditions, can crumble the moment one man is allowed to treat human beings as property. His crimes weren't acts of lust, they were strategies of dominance wrapped in silk and declared sacred. And while ancient Rome eventually erased his statues and struck his name from records, it never truly confronted the lessons he left behind. Because those lessons are uncomfortable. They ask us to see how easily systems bend to cruelty when no one dares to speak, how trauma when silenced becomes inheritance, and how power when unchecked corrodes not only laws, but souls. Today we like to think we are different, that our institutions are stronger, our leaders more accountable. But Caligula's story isn't ancient history. It's a mirror. The only difference between his empire and ours is the language we use to disguise abuse. And so we must ask, what are we allowing now, in our silence, in our complicity, that future generations will be forced to survive in shame? Caligula may be gone, but the blueprint he carved into history remains a chilling reminder that when power is left unchecked, cruelty doesn't just emerge, it becomes law. His palace is now ruins, but the pain he inflicted lives on in the silence of victims, in the cracks of broken families, in the shadows of forgotten names. This isn't just Rome's past. It's every society's warning, because the true legacy of tyranny is not the terror it unleashes, but the trauma it leaves behind, generation after generation, when good people look away and no one dares to speak.